It is the 4th of May, 1943. Somewhere over the grey, heaving expanse of the North Atlantic, a short Sunderland flying boat banks steadily through pre-dawn cloud at roughly 2,000 feet. Below, the ocean offers nothing to the naked eye. Only darkness, white caps, and the cold indifference of 3 miles of water. The crew has been airborne for 6 hours. They are tired. The smell of engine oil and damp wool fills the fuselage. Then, on a small circular screen tucked into the instrument panel, a faint smear of light appears. A blip, a return echo. Something is down there, something hard and metallic in all that formless water. The navigator marks the bearing. The pilot banks into a shallow dive. The depth charges are armed. Within 4 minutes, U-663 ceases to exist. The Germans cannot explain it. Their listening equipment, which should have detected any incoming radar signal miles in advance, had heard nothing. Their escort vessels had seen no aircraft approach. The Sunderland had descended from cloud, dropped its charges, and vanished. To the surviving officers fished from the freezing Atlantic, in the weeks and months that followed, it seemed less like technology, and more like, in the word one Kriegsmarine commander would later use, Zauberei, sorcery. What the Germans did not know, and would not fully understand until an extraordinary intelligence failure handed them the answer, was that they were being hunted by a device small enough to fit inside a shoebox. A device that weighed roughly the same as 3 bags of flour. A device that had been developed in a converted garage in Birmingham, carried to Washington inside a leather briefcase, and installed in Allied aircraft so quickly that the production lines could barely keep pace. The cavity Magnetron didn't win the Battle of the Atlantic on its own, but on the night of the 4th, 5th, and 6th of May 1943, in what historians now call Black May, it contributed to the sinking of 5 German submarines in less than 72 hours. By the end of that month, Germany had lost 41 U-boats, a rate of attrition so catastrophic that Admiral Dönitz temporarily withdrew his entire Wolfpack fleet from the Atlantic altogether. He called it the greatest crisis the U-boat arm had ever faced. The British called it the turning point. Both assessments were correct. But to understand why a 3-pound box changed the course of the Second World War, you first have to understand the problem it solved. By the winter of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was not going well for the Allies. German U-boats were sinking merchant shipping at a rate that threatened to strangle Britain's ability to continue fighting. Between January and June of that year alone, the Kriegsmarine destroyed over 4 million tons of Allied shipping, a figure so catastrophic it exceeded the combined capacity of all shipyards in Britain and America to replace it. Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat peril was the one thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Not the Blitz, not the fall of France, the submarines. The problem was geography and physics. A U-boat operating on the surface could travel at roughly 17 knots and recharge its diesel engines, which provided the electrical power its batteries needed for submerged operations. It had to surface regularly, typically at night, typically for several hours. And it was during these surfacing windows that Allied aircraft had their best opportunity to attack. But finding a submarine on the surface of the North Atlantic at night, in cloud at speed with the naked eye, was nearly impossible. What was needed was a form of radar compact enough to fit inside a patrol aircraft, powerful enough to detect a submarine's conning tower at range, and precise enough to give an accurate bearing for attack. What existed in early 1942 was completely inadequate for all 3 requirements simultaneously. The metric wavelength radar sets then in use operated on wavelengths of around 1.5 meters. They worked perfectly well for detecting aircraft at altitude, but at low altitude over water, they were almost useless. The sea surface itself returned a blizzard of false echoes, what engineers called sea clutter, that swamped the signal from any low-lying target. A submarine's conning tower, rising perhaps 4 meters above the waterline, simply disappeared into the noise. The sets were also enormous. The ASV Mark II, the principal air-to-surface radar in service at the time, required a sprawling external antenna array that added weight and drag to already heavily burdened aircraft. And the Germans had found an elegant countermeasure, a device called the METOX receiver, a crude but effective contraption that could detect the specific frequencies the ASV Mark II used, typically alerting a submarine crew in time to dive before an aircraft could close to attack range. In the third quarter of 1942, U-boat sinkings by aircraft dropped by 60%. The METOX was winning. What the Allies needed was a radar operating on a wavelength short enough, roughly 3 centimetres, that sea clutter would cease to be a problem, and that no existing German listening equipment could detect. The physics of such a system were well understood. The engineering challenge was considered essentially impossible. To generate sufficient microwave power at centimetric wavelengths, using the thermionic valve technology of 1940, you would need a transmitter roughly the size and weight of a railway locomotive. No aircraft then flying could carry such a device. To make it practical, someone would need to invent a fundamentally new way of generating radio waves. 2 physicists at the University of Birmingham did exactly that, and they did it in about 8 weeks. John Randall and Harry Boot were working at the University of Birmingham's physics department in the autumn of 1939. Their laboratory was a repurposed room in the physics building. Their equipment was modest, and their brief from the Admiralty was straightforward. Find a way to generate high-power microwave radiation without using a thermionic valve. The solution they arrived at drew on pre-war theoretical work on magnetrons, devices that use a magnetic field to accelerate electrons in circular paths. But the specific innovation Randall and Boot introduced was the cavity resonator. Instead of using a single resonant circuit to capture the energy of circling electrons, they machined a series of precisely shaped cavities into a solid copper cylinder surrounding a central cathode. When electrons emitted from the cathode were set spinning by an external magnetic field, they passed the openings of these cavities in sequence, inducing a resonant oscillation in the microwave frequency range. The cavities acted like organ pipes, each tuned to the same note, reinforcing each other until the cumulative output was extraordinary. The first working prototype, built in February 1940, generated roughly 1 kilowatt of power at a wavelength of approximately 9.5 centimetres. This was, by the standards of the time, a staggering result. Existing magnetron designs produced perhaps 1 watt at centimetric wavelengths. Randall and Boot had achieved a 1,000-fold improvement in a device that weighed less than a kilogram. Their prototype was roughly the size of a dinner plate. Subsequent engineering, led by the General Electric Company facility at Wembley and later by the Telecommunications Research Establishment at Malvern, reduced the operating wavelength to 3 centimetres and increased peak power output to over a megawatt in pulse operation. The production version of the cavity Magnetron weighed approximately 1.4 kilograms, just over 3 pounds in imperial measurement, and was roughly the size of a large thermos flask. It could fit in a coat pocket. It generated more electromagnetic power in each transmitted pulse than the entire national grid of a small country. The device worked because of timing as much as physics. Each pulse lasted roughly 1 microsecond. In that microsecond, the magnetron channeled enormous electrical energy, delivered from a capacitor bank charged during the interval between pulses, into a tight beam of microwave radiation. The beam swept the ocean surface at approximately 3 centimetres wavelength, a frequency that iron and steel reflected efficiently, but that rolling wave surfaces did not. The echo returned, was received by the same rotating antenna assembly, and was displayed on a plan position indicator, a circular screen that showed the aircraft at the centre and the surrounding ocean as a map. When a submarine's conning tower appeared in that map as a bright smear, the crew knew exactly where it was, how far away, and on what bearing. The German METOX equipment could not hear a 3 centimetre radar signal at all. Its detection range extended only to metric wavelengths. To a METOX receiver, an aircraft carrying an H2S centimetric radar set was entirely silent. The manufacturing effort required to bring the cavity magnetron into production was itself remarkable. The General Electric Company at Wembley, the Ferranti plant in Edinburgh, and a dozen subcontractors across the Midlands and Lancashire were eventually involved. Precise machining tolerances of a few thousandths of a millimetre were required for the resonant cavities, and early production yields were low. By the end of 1942, however, output had reached several hundred units per month, and by mid-1943, production had scaled to the point where virtually every long-range patrol aircraft in Coastal Command was equipped with the new set, designated ASV Mark III. The first operational deployment of centimetric air-to-surface radar occurred in late 1942, when a small number of Lee Light Wellingtons Aircraft already fitted with powerful searchlights for night attack received the new equipment. The effect was immediately apparent in the operational record. In March 1943, a Wellington of 172 Squadron, operating from Chivenor in North Devon, attacked and sank U-333 in the Bay of Biscay in complete darkness and low cloud. The U-boat crew had no warning whatsoever. Their METOX was silent. The first they knew of danger was the lee light snapping on at close range, followed almost immediately by depth charges. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. In the Bay of Biscay alone during the spring of 1943, coastal command aircraft equipped with centimetric radar sank or severely damaged over a dozen U-boats in conditions that would previously have guaranteed the submarine's safety. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound and rapid. Sailors began to speak of an invisible enemy. Reports filtered back to Dunitz that submarines were being attacked without warning, at night in poor visibility, by aircraft that gave no indication of their approach. Morale, which had been extraordinarily high during the success years of 1940 and 1941, began to fracture. Many experienced commanders began to suspect their own METOX equipment was actually transmitting a detectable signal, a theory that was, in a remarkable irony, completely incorrect, but which led the Germans to withdraw the METOX and replace it with alternative devices that were no more effective against centimetric wavelengths. The British, aware of this confusion from signals intelligence, were careful to say nothing that might correct the misapprehension. Exact figures for the number of sinkings attributable specifically to centimetric radar, as distinct from other factors such as improved convoy routing, additional escort vessels, and very long-range aircraft, remain difficult to establish with certainty. The historical record is detailed but not always cleanly separable. What can be said with confidence is that the introduction of ASV Mark III coincided precisely and causally with the reversal of U-boat fortunes in the spring of 1943. The German effort to develop comparable centimetric radar technology is a story of institutional failure as much as technical limitation. The Telefunken Company had been working on centimetric radar since 1940, and German physicists were fully aware of the theoretical possibility of cavity magnetron designs. The problem was organisational. German military procurement in the early years of the war operated on the assumption that existing technologies would suffice, an assumption fostered by the early and overwhelming successes of the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine. Long-term research into speculative technologies was frequently deprioritised in favour of immediate production of proven systems. The result was that when the tide began to turn, German engineers were attempting to catch up with British designs that had already completed 2 years of operational refinement. The American development of centimetric radar followed a different path, following the Tizard mission of September 1940, during which Henry Tizard carried a prototype cavity magnetron to Washington in a black metal box and placed it before American scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The radiation laboratory at MIT began an independent development program that would eventually produce the SCR-720 airborne radar and numerous ground-based systems. American manufacturing capacity allowed centimetric radar production to scale far faster than was possible in Britain alone. And by 1943, the two Allied programs were deeply intertwined, with British designs informing American production and American engineering capacity supporting British operational requirements. The British cavity magnetron was superior to early American equivalents in one critical respect: its operating frequency. The 3-centimetre band chosen for the H2S set proved optimal for submarine detection over the 1-centimetre and 10-centimetre bands initially explored by the MIT laboratory. The resolution of the 3-centimetre beam was fine enough to distinguish a conning tower from sea clutter at ranges of up to 12 nautical miles under good conditions, while the longer 10-centimetre sets used in some early American systems struggled to achieve comparable target discrimination at low altitude. The concept of centimetric airborne radar was adapted extensively, and the underlying magnetron principle remains in use today in everything from marine navigation equipment to, in a rather more domestic application, microwave ovens. Assessing the strategic impact of the cavity magnetron on the Second World War with any precision is complicated by the interconnected nature of the Battle of the Atlantic's turning point. The spring of 1943 saw not one breakthrough, but several arriving simultaneously. The cracking of the Enigma settings that had previously masked U-boat patrol routes, the introduction of support carrier groups that could close the mid-Atlantic air gap, the deployment of VLR Liberator aircraft that could reach areas previously beyond patrol range. The Magnetron was one instrument in an ensemble. What can be stated unambiguously is that without centimetric radar, the night surface passage of U-boats, which the Kriegsmarine considered essentially immune to air attack under darkness, would have remained viable far longer than it did. The METOX had successfully neutralized metric band radar as an effective weapon. A world without the cavity magnetron is a world in which the Battle of the Atlantic likely extends well into 1944, in which transatlantic convoy losses remain catastrophic, and in which the logistical preparation for Operation Overlord becomes severely compromised. Whether that changes the ultimate outcome of the war is a question historians have debated extensively and inconclusively. That it would have made the path to victory immeasurably longer and more costly seems beyond reasonable doubt. The psychological dimension of the magnetron's introduction deserves separate attention. The sudden, unexplained vulnerability of submarines that their crews had every reason to consider safe was corrosive in a way that direct losses alone cannot fully measure. Dönitz's withdrawal from the Atlantic in May 1943 was not forced purely by the arithmetic of losses, severe as those were. It was forced by the collapse of operational confidence, by crews who no longer trusted the darkness to protect them, who surfaced to recharge batteries with a dread they had not felt in the triumphant years of 1940 and 1941. Technology had changed the emotional geography of the ocean. A small number of cavity magnetrons from the wartime period survive in museum collections. Examples can be found at the Science Museum in London, at the RAF Museum at Hendon, and at the Telecommunications Research Establishment's successor institution. They are unimpressive objects to look at, copper cylinders the size of a large thermos, machined with great precision but without ceremony, unremarkable to the untrained eye. Nothing about their appearance suggests what they were capable of. Return for a moment to that Sunderland over the North Atlantic in the pre-dawn darkness of May 1943. The crew did not know they were flying with one of the most consequential pieces of technology produced by the Second World War. They knew only that the blip on the screen meant a target, and the target meant a threat to every merchant ship and every sailor on every convoy route in the Atlantic. They made their attack and climbed back into cloud. The mathematics of the war moved fractionally in the Allies' favour. 41 submarines in a single month, 2,500 German sailors dead, captured, or missing. Dönitz calling his fleet home to consider what had happened, and finding no adequate answer in any of his intelligence reports, no explanation in any of his technical assessments, no comfort in the silence of the METOX receivers that had, until weeks before, reliably warned of danger. The instrument he could not understand weighed 3 pounds. It had been conceived in an 8-week sprint by 2 university physicists in a repurposed laboratory in Birmingham. It had crossed the Atlantic in a leather briefcase. It had been machined in factories that, months before, had been making electric motors and domestic appliances. It required no exotic materials and no fundamental scientific discovery that was not already in the literature. It required only the specific engineering insight of how to make existing physics do something no one had managed to make it do before. That is, in the end, what the magnetron was. Not magic, not sorcery, not the invention of something unknown, but the realization of something previously known to be impossible. John Randall and Harry Boot did not discover a new principle. They demonstrated that the principle could be made to work at a scale that changed the world. Dönitz was wrong about the sorcery, but he was not wrong about the effect. The darkness that had hidden his submarines simply stopped being dark